Welcome to a story that will challenge everything you think you know about genius, prejudice, and the power of the human mind. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more incredible historical stories. The autumn rain of 1860 drummed relentlessly against the wooden shutters of St. Margaret's Orphanage, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Yorkshire, England. Sister Catherine pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she made her final rounds of the evening, the candlelight casting dancing shadows across the stone corridors. The orphanage, built in the early 1800s from local limestone, had weathered countless storms, but tonight's tempest seemed particularly fierce, as if nature itself was announcing something momentous. It was then she heard it, a faint crying that seemed to pierce through the storm's fury, cutting through the howling wind like a blade through silk. Surely not, she whispered to herself, but her heart already knew. Someone had left another child at their doorstep. In her 15 years at St. Margaret's, Sister Catherine had seen many desperate souls abandon their children to the mercy of the Church, but never during such a violent storm. What Sister Catherine discovered that night would forever change the quiet orphanage and eventually the scientific community of Victorian England. There, in a carefully woven basket, lined with what appeared to be expensive silk despite its worn condition, lay two identical baby girls. Their dark skin glistened with raindrops, and their eyes, even at such a tender age, seemed to hold an unusual depth of awareness that made Sister Catherine's breath catch in her throat. The basket itself told a story of careful preparation despite desperate circumstances. The silk lining, though faded and worn, bore the remnants of intricate embroidery that spoke of skilled hands and better times. Beneath the babies lay a small leather pouch containing a few precious coins, enough to cover basic care for several months, and a simple wooden cross carved with symbols that Sister Catherine didn't recognize. Tucked beneath the blanket was a hastily written note in broken English. "Please give them the chance we never had. They are special. Their names are Dalila and Denise Water. May God protect them from our fate. We are sorry we cannot stay to see them grow, but we pray they will know freedom we could never give them." Sister Catherine's hands trembled as she lifted the basket, her mind racing with questions. In 1860, the presence of two black children in rural Yorkshire was not just unusual, it was virtually unprecedented. The recent debates about slavery in America had reached even these remote English hills, and tensions ran high regarding people of African descent. The Underground Railroad had helped some escaped slaves reach England, but most settled in larger cities like London or Liverpool, not in isolated rural communities. "What am I to do with you, little ones?" she whispered, looking into their remarkably alert eyes. Even in the dim candlelight, she could see that these babies were different. While most newborns spent their first weeks in a haze of sleep and basic needs, these two seemed to be studying their surroundings with an intensity that was both fascinating and slightly unsettling. The answer came in the form of Professor Edmund Hartwell, a retired Cambridge scholar who had been living in self-imposed exile at the orphanage for the past 3 years. Once a brilliant mathematician and natural philosopher, Hartwell had retreated from academic life after a scandal involving his controversial theories about human intelligence and potential. His colleagues had ridiculed his suggestion that intellectual capacity might not be limited by social class or racial background, ideas that were considered not just wrong, but dangerously subversive in Victorian society. Hartwell had found solace at St. Margaret's, where he helped educate the older children and assisted Sister Catherine with administrative duties. His presence had transformed the orphanage from a simple shelter into something approaching a school, where children learned not just basic literacy and arithmetic, but were encouraged to think, question, and explore. When Sister Catherine showed him the twins the next morning, something extraordinary happened. As she held little Dalila up to the window, the infant's eyes seemed to track the geometric patterns in the stained glass with an intensity that made Hartwell's breath catch. The morning light filtered through the colored glass, creating complex patterns of light and shadow, and the baby's gaze followed the mathematical progressions with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Remarkable," he murmured, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Look at how she follows the mathematical progression in the window design. Most children don't develop such visual tracking abilities for months. And see how her eyes move. She's not just looking, she's analyzing. Professor, surely you're reading too much into... And this one, Hartwell interrupted, gently taking Denise from Sister Catherine's arms. The baby immediately stopped crying and seemed to study his face with an almost analytical expression, her tiny fingers reaching toward the light reflecting off his spectacles. There's something different about them, sister. Something exceptional. Over the following weeks, Professor Hartwell found himself inexplicably drawn to the twins. While other infants their age slept most of the day, Dalila and Denise remained alert for unusually long periods, their eyes constantly moving, observing, seemingly absorbing every detail of their surroundings. They responded to sounds with a precision that suggested not just hearing, but listening, as if they were cataloguing and analyzing every noise in their environment. The other children at the orphanage quickly noticed the twins' unusual nature. Mary, a 7-year-old who had been at St. Margaret's since infancy, was the first to comment. "Sister Catherine," she said one morning as she helped with the daily chores, "the babies watch everything. It's like they're trying to learn the whole world at once." Even more remarkable was how the twins seemed to communicate with each other from an impossibly early age. While most siblings might cry in response to each other's distress, Dalila and Denise appeared to have actual conversations, wordless exchanges of looks and gestures that conveyed meaning beyond simple emotional response. By their first birthday, the signs were undeniable. While other children were just beginning to walk, the twins were not only walking but had somehow taught themselves to stack blocks in complex geometric patterns. They communicated with each other in what appeared to be their own sophisticated language, complete with gestures that seemed to convey abstract concepts. When one twin encountered a problem, the other would immediately offer assistance, as if they shared not just thoughts but understanding. "It's impossible," Dr. William Morrison, the local physician, declared after examining them on their second birthday. "Children this age shouldn't be capable of such a coordination. The way they solve those wooden puzzles, it's as if they can see patterns that aren't even there. And their physical development, they're not just advanced, they're operating on a completely different timeline." Dr. Morrison had been practicing medicine for over 30 years, had delivered hundreds of babies and watched them grow, but he had never encountered anything like the Water twins. Their motor skills, cognitive development, and social awareness were all advancing at rates that defied every medical text he had studied. Professor Hartwell had been documenting every development, filling notebook after notebook with observations that grew more astounding by the day. The twins had begun to show an intuitive understanding of mathematical relationships that defied explanation. When presented with counting exercises, they didn't just count. They seemed to grasp the underlying numerical concepts instantly, understanding not just quantity, but the relationships between numbers. "They're not just intelligent," Hartwell confided to Sister Catherine one evening, as they watched 3-year-old Dalila and Denise working together to solve a puzzle designed for children twice their age. "They're operating on a level I've never witnessed. It's as if their minds process information in ways we don't yet understand. They see connections that escape even educated adults." The puzzle in question was a complex wooden construction that required understanding spatial relationships, sequential logic, and pattern recognition. Most children their age would have been content to simply stack the pieces or use them as toys, but Dalila and Denise approached it methodically, testing hypotheses, learning from failures, and building on each other's insights until they achieved a solution that had stumped several visiting adults. But it was on a cold December morning in 1863 that the true extent of their abilities became impossible to ignore. Professor Hartwell had been working on a complex mathematical proof in his study, a problem in geometric progression that had been puzzling him for weeks, when 4-year-old Dalila wandered in, followed closely by Denise. "Professor," Dalila said in her clear, articulate voice that still amazed everyone who heard it, "your equation is missing a variable." Hartwell looked up from his papers, startled. The children had never shown interest in his mathematical work before, and he had assumed it was far beyond their comprehension. "I beg your pardon?" Denise stepped forward, pointing to a specific line in his calculations with the confidence of a graduate student. "The relationship between the angles assumes a constant, but you haven't accounted for the progressive change in the coefficient. See here, she traced a line with her small finger. You're treating this as a static relationship, but it's actually dynamic. The professor's hands began to shake as he examined his work. The children were absolutely correct. Not only had they identified an error that had eluded him for weeks, but they had done so by understanding mathematical concepts that weren't typically taught until university level. More than that, they had grasped the fundamental flaw in his approach. He had been thinking in 2 dimensions when the problem required 3-dimensional analysis. "How did you—" he began, but the words failed him. "We can see it," Dalila explained simply, as if discussing the weather. "The numbers have patterns like music. When something doesn't fit, it sounds wrong. Your equation has a discord in the 3rd movement." "Movement?" Hartwell asked, fascinated despite his shock. "Mathematical progressions have rhythm," Denise added. "This one starts in 4/4 time, but shifts to 3/4 in the middle without accounting for the transition. That's why it feels incomplete." That night, Professor Hartwell wrote a letter that would change everything. Addressed to his former colleague, Dr. Charles Whitmore at the Royal Society of London, it contained a request that would soon bring the attention of Britain's most prominent scientists to a small orphanage in Yorkshire. "My dear Charles," the letter began, "I write to you about a discovery that challenges everything we believe we know about human intelligence and capability. I have in my care 2 children whose mental abilities appear to transcend the known boundaries of human potential. I realize how this must sound, but I implore you to consider the evidence I am prepared to present. These children are not simply precocious. They are operating on a cognitive level that defies our current understanding of human development. Their existence raises questions that could revolutionize our understanding of the mind itself." As 1863 drew to a close, Dalila and Denise Water, now 4 years old, continued their extraordinary development, unaware that their remarkable gifts would soon thrust them into a world of scientific scrutiny, social prejudice, and political intrigue that would test not just their intelligence, but their very humanity. The twins had no way of knowing that their journey was about to begin in earnest, or that the greatest challenges they would face wouldn't come from the complex problems they could solve so effortlessly, but from a society that wasn't ready to accept that genius could emerge from the most unexpected places. In the quiet moments before sleep, as Sister Catherine tucked them into their small beds, the twins would whisper to each other in their private language, sharing thoughts and dreams that no adult could comprehend. They spoke of numbers that danced like stars, of patterns that sang like birds, and of a future where understanding would bridge the gaps between all people. They were still children, despite their extraordinary gifts, and they dreamed as children do, of adventure, of discovery, and of a world where their differences would be celebrated rather than feared. But even in their innocence, they sensed that their path would not be easy, and that the very gifts that brought them joy would also bring them trials they could not yet imagine. The carriage wheels crunched through the frost-covered gravel as Dr. Charles Whitmore arrived at St. Margaret's Orphanage on a bitter January morning in 1864. Behind him followed a procession of London's most distinguished minds: Dr. Reginald Pemberton from the Royal College of Physicians, Professor James Blackwood from Oxford's Department of Natural Philosophy, and Dr. Margaret Thornfield, one of the few women permitted to observe such scientific inquiries. The journey from London had taken 2 days through increasingly treacherous winter weather, but Dr. Whitmore's curiosity had been thoroughly aroused by Professor Hartwell's extraordinary claims. As one of Britain's most respected natural philosophers, Whitmore had built his reputation on careful observation and rigorous skepticism. He had seen countless supposed prodigies over the years, children who could perform impressive feats of memory or calculation, but who invariably proved to be the products of intensive training rather than genuine intellectual advancement. The scientific community was buzzing with rumors about the Yorkshire phenomenon. Some dismissed it as elaborate fraud, others as wishful thinking by an isolated academic seeking relevance. But a few, including Dr. Thornfield, suspected that something genuinely unprecedented might be occurring in the remote orphanage. Professor Hartwell met them at the entrance, his excitement barely contained despite his attempts at scholarly composure. The years of isolation had taken their toll on his appearance. His hair had grown wilder, his clothes more rumpled, but his eyes burned with the intensity of a man who had witnessed something that challenged the very foundations of human understanding. "Gentlemen, Dr. Thornfield, I must prepare you for what you're about to witness. These children, they operate beyond any framework we currently possess for understanding human cognition. I've spent months documenting their development, and I confess that my own scientific training feels inadequate to explain what I've observed." Dr. Whitmore, a stern man with greying whiskers and skeptical eyes, adjusted his coat against the cold. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he spoke. "Edmund, your letter made extraordinary claims. I trust you understand the gravity of bringing us here, based on the supposed abilities of two children." The pause before "children" wasn't lost on anyone present. In 1864, the scientific establishment's views on race and intelligence were deeply entrenched in prejudice, making the claims about Dalila and Denise even more controversial. The very idea that two black children could possess superior intellectual abilities challenged fundamental assumptions about human hierarchy that underpinned much of Victorian society. Dr. Pemberton, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers, shifted uncomfortably. "Hartwell, you must understand our position. The Royal College has a reputation to maintain. If we're seen endorsing claims about exceptional abilities in children of African descent, it could have significant political ramifications." "I understand completely," Hartwell replied, his voice steady despite the implicit threat, "which is why I've prepared a series of examinations that will speak for themselves. I ask only that you observe with open minds and judge based on evidence rather than preconception." They were led through the orphanage's corridors, past curious children who peered around doorframes to catch glimpses of the distinguished visitors. The building itself told the story of gradual transformation under Hartwell's influence. What had once been a simple shelter now showed signs of serious educational activity. Mathematical diagrams covered some walls, while others displayed maps, botanical illustrations, and astronomical charts. They arrived at the orphanage's largest room, where 5-year-old Dalila and Denise sat quietly at a small table, their posture remarkably composed for children their age. Both wore simple grey dresses that Sister Catherine had sewn, their hair neatly braided with ribbons. What struck the visitors immediately was the twins' eyes, alert, curious, and somehow ancient in their depth. The room itself had been arranged like a laboratory, with various testing materials laid out on tables, mathematical instruments, books, puzzles of increasing complexity, and scientific apparatus that seemed almost comically oversized for such young subjects. "Good morning," Dalila said politely, rising from her chair with the grace of a much older child. "Professor Hartwell told us you've come to see if we're really as clever as he believes. We're honored by your visit." Denise stood as well, adding with a slight smile that seemed to contain layers of meaning, "We're quite curious about your tests. We've been wondering what kinds of problems you might bring. Professor Hartwell has told us about your work, Dr. Whitmore. Your paper on thermodynamic principles was particularly interesting, though we had some questions about your conclusions regarding entropy in closed systems." Dr. Pemberton exchanged glances with his colleagues, his face pale. Children of 5 typically possessed vocabularies of perhaps 200 words and spoke in simple sentences. These girls spoke with the articulation and complexity of educated adults, and they were referencing advanced scientific concepts that most university students would struggle to understand. "Very well," Dr. Whitmore said, opening his leather satchel with hands that trembled slightly. "Let's begin with something simple." He placed a series of wooden blocks on the table, geometric shapes of varying sizes and colors, a standard test for spatial reasoning in young children. "Can you arrange these in order of size?" Dalila and Denise looked at the blocks for perhaps 3 seconds, their eyes moving in perfect synchronization as they analyzed the challenge. Then Denise spoke, her voice carrying a patience that suggested she understood the adult's need for gradual progression. "You want us to demonstrate basic classification skills, but the exercise is more complex than it appears. Are we ordering by volume, surface area, or linear dimension? And should we account for the density variations suggested by the different wood grains? This oak cylinder, for instance, has significantly different mass characteristics than the pine cube, which would affect any meaningful size comparison. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Dr. Blackwood leaned forward, his academic composure cracking like ice in spring. Excuse me, did you just analyze the material composition of the blocks? The blocks aren't uniform, Dalila explained patiently, picking up each piece and examining it with the eye of an experienced craftsman. This one appears to be English oak, while this cylinder is clearly Scots pine. The grain patterns and density are quite different. If you want a meaningful comparison, we need to establish whether we're measuring physical size, mass, or perhaps some combination of dimensional and material properties. She paused, then added with a slight smile, also the question assumes that size is a single-dimensional concept, but in reality size is multidimensional. A sphere and a cube might have the same volume, but very different surface areas. Which property defines size depends on the context of the measurement. Professor Hartwell watched his colleagues' faces with satisfaction mixed with concern. He had witnessed this kind of analysis from the twins countless times, but he could see that his visitors were struggling to process what they were hearing. Dr. Thornfield, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward. "May I?" She produced a sheet of paper covered with mathematical equations, her hands steady despite the extraordinary nature of what she was witnessing. "These are problems typically given to first-year university students. Could you take a look?" The twins examined the paper together, their heads bent close as they whispered to each other in what sounded like a mixture of English and their own private language. Their conversation was rapid and intense, filled with gestures that seemed to convey complex mathematical concepts. After less than 2 minutes, Denise looked up. "The third equation has an error," she said matter-of-factly. "You've assumed the function is continuous, but there's a discontinuity at x equals -2. The limit approaches infinity from the left, but negative infinity from the right, which means the function is undefined at that point. And the fifth problem," Dalila continued, "it's not solvable as written because you're missing a boundary condition. You've defined the differential equation, but haven't specified initial conditions, which means there are infinite possible solutions." Dr. Thornfield's face went pale. She had deliberately included those errors to test whether the children would simply attempt solutions or actually analyze the problem's validity. In her experience, even advanced students typically tried to solve problems as presented rather than questioning their fundamental structure. That's absolutely correct," she managed to say. "But more interesting," Dalila continued, her eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm, "is that these problems all relate to a larger theorem about harmonic motion. If you're studying wave propagation, you might want to consider the implications of variable density media. The mathematical relationships suggest applications in acoustics and possibly even electromagnetic theory." The distinguished scientists stood in stunned silence. Dr. Whitmore finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Where did you learn about harmonic motion and wave propagation? These are advanced topics that require years of mathematical preparation." "We didn't learn it," Denise replied matter-of-factly, as if explaining something obvious to a younger child. "We can see the relationships. Mathematics isn't something you memorize, it's something you recognize. The patterns are there in nature, in music, in the way light moves through water. Once you see the underlying structure, the applications become clear." Over the next 4 hours, the twins were subjected to increasingly complex examinations. They solved geometric proofs that challenged graduate students, demonstrated an intuitive understanding of natural philosophy that surpassed many professors, and displayed memory capabilities that seemed almost supernatural in their precision. But it was during the final test that something truly extraordinary occurred. Dr. Blackwood had presented them with a problem in celestial mechanics, calculating the orbital period of a hypothetical planet given specific parameters. It was a problem he had designed to be solvable but challenging, requiring knowledge of gravitational theory and advanced calculus. As the twins worked together, their private language became more animated. They seemed to be building on each other's thoughts in real time, their conversation flowing between English and their mysterious dialect. Their pencils moved across the paper in perfect coordination, creating diagrams and calculations that grew increasingly complex. "Fascinating," Dalila murmured, her pencil moving rapidly across the paper as she sketched orbital diagrams. "But Professor Blackwood, your hypothetical planet couldn't exist in the orbit you've described." "I beg your pardon?" Denise looked up from their calculations, her young face serious with scientific concern. The gravitational interactions with the other planetary bodies would destabilize the orbit within approximately 847 years. The system would either eject the planet or cause it to spiral into the central star. The mathematics are quite clear. This is what we call a chaotic attractor in the three-body problem. Dr. Blackwood's jaw dropped. The problem had been designed as a pure mathematical exercise, but the twins had intuitively grasped the physical impossibility of the scenario, a level of understanding that required knowledge of gravitational mechanics that wouldn't be formalized for decades. "How could you possibly know about orbital stability?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "The same way we know that your coat button is about to fall off," Dalila said with a slight smile. "Patterns reveal themselves when you know how to look. The mathematical relationships that govern planetary motion are the same ones that describe the stress distribution in your button thread. Everything is connected." As the day concluded, the scientists gathered in Professor Hartwell's study, their worldviews fundamentally shaken. The small room, lined with books and papers documenting the twins' development, felt like the epicenter of a scientific earthquake. "It's impossible," Dr. Pemberton whispered, his hands shaking as he poured himself a glass of brandy. "Children cannot possess such capabilities. There must be some explanation, some trick or deception." "What deception?" Dr. Thornfield demanded, her voice sharp with frustration. "They solved original problems, identified errors in established work, and demonstrated understanding of principles that most scholars struggle with after years of study. Are you suggesting that 2 5-year-old children have been trained to fake advanced mathematical intuition?" Dr. Whitmore paced the small room, his scientific rationality warring with the evidence of his own eyes. "If what we've witnessed is genuine, then everything we believe about human intelligence, about cognitive development, about—" He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "About the intellectual capabilities of different races. Everything would need to be reconsidered." Professor Hartwell nodded gravely, understanding the magnitude of what his colleagues were grappling with. "That's exactly what I realized months ago. These children aren't just exceptionally intelligent, they're operating on a level that challenges our fundamental understanding of human potential. They force us to question whether our assumptions about intelligence, about capability, about human worth itself, are based on science or prejudice." "But how is it possible?" Dr. Blackwood asked, his voice hollow with shock. "What could account for such extraordinary abilities? Are we witnessing some kind of evolutionary leap? A genetic anomaly? Divine intervention?" "Perhaps," Dr. Thornfield suggested quietly, her scientific mind already working to process the implications. "We've been asking the wrong questions. Instead of wondering how it's possible, we should be asking what it means for our understanding of human nature itself. If these children can achieve such understanding, what does that say about the potential that might exist in others? What does it say about the limitations we've assumed were natural law?" As the scientists prepared to return to London, each carried with them the weight of a discovery that would soon send shockwaves through the academic world. Word of the Yorkshire prodigies would spread rapidly through scientific circles, bringing fame, scrutiny, and danger to 2 little girls who had already begun to outthink the greatest minds of their generation. But with recognition would come new challenges. In a world where intelligence was believed to be the exclusive domain of white European males, the existence of Dalila and Denise Water represented more than just a scientific anomaly. They represented a threat to the very foundations of Victorian society's beliefs about race, capability, and human worth. The twins, now 5 years old, continued their extraordinary development, unaware that their remarkable gifts had just made them the most famous and potentially the most endangered children in all of Britain. By the spring of 1865, The names Dalila and Denise Water had become whispered legends in the halls of Europe's greatest universities. Scientific journals published heated debates about the Yorkshire phenomenon, while skeptics demanded proof, and believers proclaimed a new era of human understanding. The Royal Society's official report on the twins had been read and discussed in academic circles from Edinburgh to Vienna, sparking controversies that extended far beyond the realm of pure science. But fame, as the twins would soon discover, came with a price that even their extraordinary minds couldn't have calculated. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of Lord Reginald Ashworth, a prominent member of Parliament and vocal supporter of racial hierarchies. His carriage pulled up to St. Margaret's Orphanage on a grey April morning, accompanied by two stern-faced men in dark coats who bore the unmistakable bearing of government officials. The very air seemed to grow heavier as they approached the orphanage, their presence casting a shadow over the peaceful grounds where the twins had spent their formative years. Lord Ashworth was a man accustomed to power and deference. His family had built their fortune on colonial enterprises, and he had spent his political career defending the natural order that placed white European males at the apex of human achievement. The reports about two black children possessing superior intellectual abilities represented more than just a scientific curiosity to him. They represented a direct challenge to the philosophical foundations of his worldview. "Professor Hartwell," Lord Ashworth announced without preamble as he strode into the orphanage, his walking stick clicking against the stone floor with military precision. "I've come to discuss the future of these children." Sister Catherine, who had grown fiercely protective of the twins over the years, stepped forward with the courage that had sustained her through decades of caring for society's most vulnerable members. "My lord, if you wish to visit, you must make proper arrangements. This is a house of God and learning, not a political arena. I'm not here for a social call, sister." Ashworth's voice carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "These children have become a matter of national interest. There are concerns about the implications of their alleged abilities, concerns that extend to the highest levels of government." The political implications were indeed significant. The American Civil War was raging, and Britain's position on slavery and racial equality was under intense scrutiny. The existence of two black children who could outthink Cambridge professors threatened to undermine arguments about racial hierarchy that justified colonial policies and social structures throughout the empire. Professor Hartwell emerged from his study, where he had been working with 6-year-old Dalila and Denise, on advanced principles of natural philosophy. The years of documenting their development had transformed him from a retired academic into something approaching a revolutionary, though he had never intended such a role. "Lord Ashworth, I wasn't expecting—" "No, I imagine you weren't." Ashworth's eyes were hard as flint, reflecting years of political maneuvering and the ruthless pragmatism required to maintain power in Victorian society. "Tell me, Professor, do you understand what you've unleashed with your claims about these children?" "I've unleashed nothing but the truth," Hartwell replied firmly, though his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his awareness of the dangerous ground they were treading. "Dalila and Denise possess intellectual capabilities that challenge our understanding of human potential. That's not a political statement, it's a scientific observation." "That challenge the natural order," Ashworth interrupted, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. "Do you have any idea how your discoveries are being interpreted? There are those who would use these children as evidence against the established understanding of racial capabilities. They're becoming symbols, Professor, and symbols can be dangerous to the stability of society." The conversation was taking place in the orphanage's main hall, where portraits of previous benefactors looked down with painted eyes that seemed to judge the proceedings. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, oblivious to the momentous nature of the confrontation unfolding below. At that moment, Dalila and Denise appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. Their presence seemed to fill the room with an almost electric tension, as if the very air recognized the significance of their arrival. At 6 years old, they had grown into children whose bearing and expression suggested wisdom far beyond their years. "Good afternoon, Lord Ashworth," Dalila said politely. though her young face showed a wariness beyond her years. "We've read about your speeches in Parliament regarding colonial policy. Your arguments about administrative efficiency in India were particularly interesting, though we noticed some flaws in your economic projections." The statement hung in the air like a challenge thrown down by a knight before a joust. Lord Ashworth's face flushed red, the colour spreading from his collar to his receding hairline. "How dare you?" "The population growth calculations you cited," Denise continued calmly, her voice carrying the measured tone of a seasoned economist, "don't account for the impact of improved agricultural techniques that are already being implemented in several districts. Your estimates are likely off by at least 15%, which would significantly affect your proposed taxation structures and could lead to serious revenue shortfalls." "Furthermore," Dalila added, stepping forward with the confidence of someone presenting a well-researched academic paper, "your assumptions about labor productivity don't consider the correlation between worker education and output efficiency. The data from the Manchester textile mills suggests that investment in basic education yields returns of approximately 300% over a 10-year period." The silence that followed was deafening. Here were two 6-year-old children, calmly correcting the economic theories of one of Britain's most powerful politicians, citing data and drawing conclusions that would have impressed seasoned government advisers. Lord Ashworth's political instincts warred with his shock. He had come prepared to deal with precocious children, perhaps even clever ones, but he had not expected to encounter minds that could dissect his policies with surgical precision. "This is exactly what I mean," he said through gritted teeth, his voice barely controlled. "These children are being used to promote dangerous ideas about equality and capability. It must stop." Professor Hartwell stepped protectively in front of the twins, his academic robes rustling with the movement. "Are you suggesting we should hide their abilities, pretend they don't exist, deny the evidence of our own observations?" "I'm suggesting," Ashworth replied coldly, his political mask slipping back into place, "that there are institutions better equipped to handle such unusual cases, places where they can be properly studied and contained. The Royal Institution has facilities for examining anomalous phenomena. The children would receive excellent care while contributing to scientific understanding." The word "contained" sent a chill through the room like a winter wind through an open door. Sister Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her throat while Professor Hartwell's face went pale with understanding. They were talking about taking the children away, isolating them from everything they had known, turning them into subjects rather than students. "You're talking about taking them away," Hartwell said, his voice hollow with realization. "I'm talking about protecting the stability of our society," Ashworth replied with the cold logic of political necessity. "These children represent an anomaly that threatens established scientific and social principles. They need to be studied by proper authorities, away from the public eye, where their influence can be properly managed." The implications were clear. The twins had become too visible, too challenging to the established order. Their very existence raised questions that powerful people preferred to leave unasked, and their abilities suggested possibilities that threatened the foundations of imperial policy. It was then that Denise spoke, her young voice carrying a weight that seemed impossible for someone her age. "Lord Ashworth, you're afraid of us. I beg your pardon? You're not concerned about social stability," Dalila added, stepping forward beside her sister with the courage of someone who had never learned to doubt her own worth. "You're afraid that our existence challenges your beliefs about who deserves respect and opportunity. You're afraid that if people see what we can do, they might question other assumptions about human worth." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon. Ashworth's carefully constructed political persona cracked, revealing the fear and anger beneath. "How dare you speak to me in such a manner? You are children. We are human beings," Denise said quietly, her words carrying the moral authority of absolute truth. "With minds that happen to work differently than most, that doesn't make us dangerous. It makes us different." "And difference," Dalila concluded, her voice rising with passion, "shouldn't be something to fear. It should be something to celebrate, to learn from, to nurture. The fact that we can think and reason and solve problems doesn't threaten anyone. unless they believe that intelligence is somehow limited to people who look like them. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Margaret Thornfield, who had been making regular visits to document the twins' development. She swept into the room with the authority of someone who had fought for recognition in a male-dominated field and had learned to project confidence even in the face of overwhelming opposition. "Lord Ashworth," she said coolly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk, "I wasn't aware you had developed an interest in child psychology." "Dr. Thornfield, I should have expected to find you here, encouraging this spectacle." "I'm documenting one of the most significant discoveries in human cognitive science," she replied firmly, her scientific integrity blazing like a beacon in the political darkness. "These children represent a breakthrough in our understanding of intelligence and potential. To suppress or hide their abilities would be a crime against human knowledge." "They represent a threat to social order," Ashworth countered, his political instincts reasserting themselves. "Only if you believe that social order depends on limiting human potential based on arbitrary characteristics," Dr. Thornfield shot back, her years of fighting for recognition as a female scientist lending steel to her voice. "Only if you think that society is so fragile that it cannot accommodate the existence of exceptional minds in unexpected packages." As the adults argued, their voices rising with passion and conviction, Dalila and Denise exchanged glances and began speaking in their private language. Their conversation was rapid and intense, filled with gestures that seemed to convey complex ideas about strategy, negotiation, and human nature. Finally, Dalila turned to address the room, her young voice cutting through the adult arguments with the clarity of a bell. "We've been discussing the situation, and we have a proposal." All eyes turned to the 6-year-old girl, who spoke with the confidence of a seasoned diplomat, her bearing suggesting wisdom accumulated over lifetimes rather than years. "Lord Ashworth, you're concerned about the social implications of our abilities. Dr. Thornfield, you want to study and document our development. Professor Hartwell and Sister Catherine want to protect us. We want to continue learning and growing." Denise stepped forward, her expression serious but hopeful. "So we propose a compromise. We'll submit to formal testing and documentation by qualified scientists, but we remain here in our home with the people who care for us. In exchange, we ask for access to advanced educational materials and the freedom to pursue our intellectual development without interference." "And," Dalila added with a slight smile that seemed far too knowing for her age, "we promise to be discreet about correcting the errors in government policy papers, at least in public." Despite the tension, Dr. Thornfield couldn't suppress a small laugh. "Remarkable. They're negotiating their own terms." Lord Ashworth stared at the twins for a long moment, his political mind clearly working through the implications, calculating advantages and risks with the precision of a chess master contemplating a complex endgame. Finally, he spoke. "You understand that this arrangement would require oversight, regular reports, assurance that your development doesn't become a source of social disruption." "We understand," Denise replied with the gravity of someone signing a treaty. "We also understand that our existence challenges certain assumptions, but we believe that truth is more important than comfort." "And we believe," Dalila added, her young voice carrying the weight of prophecy, "that human potential shouldn't be limited by fear or prejudice. We're willing to prove that intelligence and wisdom can coexist with humility and discretion." As Lord Ashworth departed that day, his carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive, he carried with him the unsettling realization that he had just been outmaneuvered by 2 6-year-old children. But more disturbing was the growing certainty that these remarkable girls represented something far more significant than a simple anomaly. They represented the future, a future where intelligence and capability couldn't be predicted or limited by race, class, or circumstance. And for those whose power depended on maintaining such limitations, that future was indeed something to fear. The twins had won their first major battle, but they had also learned a crucial lesson. Their extraordinary gifts would always make them targets for those who preferred a world where genius came in predictable packages. As 1865 progressed, Dalila and Denise continued their remarkable development under the watchful eyes of scientists, politicians, and a society struggling to understand what their existence meant for everything they thought they knew about human nature. The greatest challenges, however, still lay ahead. The year 1867 marked a turning point not just for Dalila and Denise Water, but for the scientific understanding of human potential itself. Now 8 years old, the twins had become the subjects of the most comprehensive study of cognitive development ever undertaken, their every achievement documented by a team of researchers led by Dr. Margaret Thornfield. The St. Margaret's Institute, as it had come to be known, had evolved from a simple orphanage into a revolutionary center of learning that attracted visitors from across Europe and beyond. But it was on a crisp October morning that their most significant contribution to human knowledge would emerge, not from a laboratory or examination room, but from a simple conversation that would reshape the future of education and scientific inquiry. The morning began like many others, with the twins engaged in their daily routine of advanced study and research. Their living quarters had been transformed into something resembling a university laboratory, with mathematical instruments, scientific texts, and experimental apparatus that would have been the envy of many established institutions. The walls were covered with their own diagrams and calculations, creating a visual record of minds that operated on levels that continued to astonish even their most experienced observers. Professor Hartwell found the twins in the orphanage garden, where they often retreated to think and discuss their latest discoveries. They sat beneath an ancient oak tree, whose branches had witnessed decades of human drama, surrounded by papers covered with diagrams and equations that would have challenged university professors. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the falling leaves created a carpet of gold and crimson around their makeshift outdoor study. "What are you working on today?" he asked, settling beside them on the grass with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had shared countless such moments over the years. Dalila looked up from her calculations, her eyes bright with the excitement of discovery that had never dimmed despite years of intensive study. "We've been thinking about the problem of knowledge transfer, Professor. How do you teach someone to see patterns the way we do? How do you help others develop their own unique cognitive abilities?" "It's not enough for us to solve problems," Denise added, her voice carrying a maturity that still amazed everyone who heard it, despite years of exposure to her remarkable development. "If our abilities are truly unusual, then we have a responsibility to help others develop their own potential. We've been blessed with these gifts, but what good are they if they remain isolated?" Professor Hartwell felt his breath catch, recognizing the profound implications of what the twins were suggesting. "You want to teach?" "We want to understand how learning really works," Dalila explained, her young face serious with purpose. "Most education assumes that all minds work the same way, but that's clearly not true. We think differently than most people, but that doesn't mean other people can't think more effectively than they currently do. Everyone has unique cognitive patterns. The problem is that traditional education doesn't recognize or nurture that diversity. We've been observing the other children here at St. Margaret's," Denise continued, gesturing toward the orphanage where their fellow residents were engaged in their daily lessons. "Each one has different strengths, different ways of processing information, different types of intelligence, but they're all taught the same way, expected to learn at the same pace, measured by the same standards." The twins had indeed been conducting their own informal research, watching how their fellow orphans approached problems, learned new concepts, and expressed their understanding. What they had discovered was a rich tapestry of cognitive diversity that traditional educational methods completely ignored. Over the following months, the twins began developing what they called adaptive learning principles, methods for identifying individual cognitive patterns and tailoring instruction accordingly. Working with Dr. Thornfield and a growing team of progressive educators who had been drawn to St. Margaret's by reports of the twins' abilities, they created techniques that would later revolutionize pedagogical theory. Their approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of forcing all students to learn in the same way, they developed methods for identifying how each individual mind naturally processed information. Some children, they discovered, were visual learners who understood concepts through spatial relationships, Others were auditory learners who grasped ideas through rhythm and sound. Still others were kinesthetic learners who needed physical movement and manipulation to understand abstract concepts. The key, Dalila explained to Dr. Thornfield during one of their research sessions, is recognizing that intelligence isn't a single thing. It's a collection of different capabilities that combine in unique ways in each person. Traditional education tries to develop one type of intelligence and ignores the rest. But if you can identify someone's natural cognitive patterns, Denise added, you can teach them in ways that work with their mind rather than against it. Learning becomes natural instead of forced. Their first test subjects were the other children at St. Margaret's Orphanage. Within weeks, children who had struggled with basic arithmetic were solving complex problems, and those who had difficulty with reading were devouring advanced texts. The transformation was so dramatic that visiting educators initially suspected some form of deception. "It's remarkable," Dr. Thornfield wrote in her journal, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. "The twins have identified something fundamental about human learning that we've completely overlooked. They're not just intellectually gifted, they're natural teachers who understand how to unlock potential in others." The success at St. Margaret's attracted attention from progressive educators across Europe. Word of their educational innovations spread rapidly through academic circles, carried by visitors who came to observe the Yorkshire prodigies, and left with their understanding of human potential fundamentally altered. By 1868, delegations from universities across Europe were making pilgrimages to the small Yorkshire orphanage to observe the twins' methods. The contrast was striking. Distinguished professors and educational theorists coming to learn from two 8-year-old children who had revolutionized the understanding of how minds develop and learn. But perhaps their most significant visitor arrived on a snowy December day in 1868. Charles Darwin himself, now an elderly man but still sharp and curious, had come to meet the children whose existence seemed to support his theories about human variation and potential. The great naturalist had been following reports of the twins' development with intense interest, seeing in their story confirmation of his ideas about the diversity and adaptability of human nature. "Miss Dalila, Miss Denise," Darwin said as he settled into Professor Hartwell's study, where the 9-year-old twins waited with characteristic poise. "I've read Dr. Thornfield's reports with great interest. Your abilities suggest remarkable variations in human cognitive capacity." "Mr. Darwin," Dalila replied respectfully, her young voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the significance of the moment, "we've read your work on natural selection. We're particularly interested in your thoughts about the inheritance of mental characteristics." "Indeed? And what conclusions have you drawn?" Denise leaned forward, her expression serious with scientific purpose. "We think you're partially correct about inheritance, but you're missing something important. Intelligence isn't just inherited, it's also shaped by opportunity, environment, and most crucially by the belief that it can be developed. Our own abilities might be unusual," Dalila continued, "but we've discovered that most people have far greater potential than they realize. The problem isn't lack of capability, it's lack of proper cultivation. It's like a garden where only certain types of plants are allowed to grow, while others are treated as weeds." Darwin's eyes widened with the excitement of a scientist encountering a new and significant discovery. "You're suggesting that intelligence is more malleable than we've assumed?" "We're suggesting," Denise said with a slight smile, "that human potential is far greater and more varied than anyone has imagined. Our existence proves that extraordinary capability can emerge from any background. But more importantly, our work with other children proves that everyone's capabilities can be significantly enhanced with the right approach." "It's like music," Dalila added, searching for an analogy that would convey their understanding. "Everyone has the capacity for music, but some people are naturally gifted with melody, others with rhythm, others with harmony. Traditional education is like trying to teach everyone to be violinists, when some are natural drummers and others are born to sing." The conversation that followed lasted for hours, covering topics from cognitive development to social evolution, from the nature of genius to the future of human society. Darwin left the orphanage with his understanding of human potential fundamentally altered, carrying with him ideas that would influence his later work on human evolution and the development of mental faculties. "Those children," he wrote to a colleague, "represent not just an anomaly, but a glimpse into what human beings might become if we truly understood how to nurture and develop the mind. They have shown me that the variation in human capability is far greater than I had imagined, and that the potential for development extends far beyond what we currently believe possible." As 1869 dawned, the twins faced a new challenge. Now 10 years old, they had outgrown even the most advanced educational resources available. Universities across Europe were extending invitations for them to attend as special students, while governments sought to recruit them for various national projects. The world, it seemed, was finally ready to acknowledge their extraordinary gifts. But Dalila and Denise had their own plans, shaped by years of observation and reflection on the nature of human potential and the responsibility that came with exceptional abilities. "We've been thinking about our future," Dalila announced to Professor Hartwell and Sister Catherine one spring morning, her voice carrying the weight of carefully considered decision. "We want to establish a school." "A school?" Sister Catherine asked, her maternal instincts immediately engaged. "A place where children can learn according to their own cognitive patterns," Denise explained, her young face glowing with vision and purpose. "Where potential is nurtured regardless of background or circumstances. Where the goal isn't to create conformity, but to develop each individual's unique capabilities." "We want to create an environment," Dalila continued, "where every child can discover their own form of genius, where difference is celebrated rather than suppressed, where learning is natural and joyful rather than forced and painful." Professor Hartwell smiled, recognizing the vision that had been growing in the twins' minds for months. "And where would you establish this school?" "Here," Dalila said simply, gesturing to encompass the orphanage that had been their home for nearly a decade. "St. Margaret's has been our home. We want to transform it into something that can help other children the way you've helped us." Over the following years, their vision became reality through a combination of scientific innovation, educational reform, and social transformation that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The St. Margaret's Institute for Adaptive Learning became a beacon for progressive education, attracting students and teachers from around the world who came to study and implement the revolutionary methods developed by two remarkable children. The twins, now in their teens, served as both students and instructors, continuing their own development while helping others unlock their potential. Their methods proved so effective that by 1875, similar institutions had been established across Europe and America. The water method of adaptive learning became the foundation for educational reforms that would benefit millions of children over the coming decades. But perhaps their greatest achievement was more subtle and far-reaching. Through their existence and their work, Dalila and Denise Water had fundamentally challenged society's assumptions about human worth and potential. They had proven that extraordinary capability could emerge from any background, and that intelligence was not the exclusive domain of any particular race or class. Their influence extended beyond education into the realms of science, philosophy, and social policy. The questions they raised about human potential led to new research in psychology and cognitive science. Their success challenged racial theories that had been used to justify oppression and inequality. Their methods inspired educational reforms that recognized and nurtured diverse forms of intelligence. As they reached adulthood, the twins continued their groundbreaking work in education and cognitive science. Dalila became a renowned mathematician and natural philosopher, making contributions to fields ranging from theoretical physics to applied engineering. Denise focused on psychology and educational theory, developing frameworks for understanding and nurturing human potential that would influence generations of educators and researchers. Together, they published works that would influence scientific thought for generations, but they never forgot the lesson they had learned as children, that their greatest responsibility was not to showcase their own abilities, but to help others discover and develop their own potential. In 1885, on the 25th anniversary of their arrival at St. Margaret's Orphanage, The twins reflected on their extraordinary journey. They had faced prejudice, fear, and attempts to limit their development, but they had also found supporters who believed in their potential and helped them flourish. "We were fortunate," Dalila said, as they stood in the garden where they had spent so many hours thinking and learning, the ancient oak tree now bearing a plaque commemorating their contributions to human understanding. "We found people who saw our potential rather than our limitations. And now," Denise added, her voice carrying the weight of a life dedicated to service, "it's our responsibility to ensure that other children have the same opportunity, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Their legacy extended far beyond their individual achievements. The educational principles they developed, the institutions they founded, and the social barriers they broke down created ripple effects that would continue for generations. The St. Margaret's Institute had become a model replicated across continents, while their research into cognitive diversity had fundamentally altered how society understood human intelligence. By the 1890s, their influence could be seen in legislative changes that expanded educational opportunities for all children, regardless of race or social class. The water principles had been incorporated into teacher training programs throughout Europe and America, while their research had inspired a new generation of scientists and educators who continued to push the boundaries of human understanding. Most importantly, they had proven that human potential knows no boundaries, that genius can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that every child deserves the opportunity to discover and develop their unique gifts. Their story had become a powerful symbol of hope for marginalized communities around the world, demonstrating that extraordinary achievement was possible regardless of one's origins. The two little girls who had arrived at a Yorkshire orphanage on a stormy night in 1860 had grown into women who changed the world, not through conquest or politics, but through the simple yet revolutionary act of proving that every human being possesses extraordinary potential waiting to be discovered. In their later years, as they watched former students become leaders in science, education, and social reform, Dalila and Denise often reflected on the mysterious circumstances of their early life. They had never learned the full story of their parents, the escaped slaves who had sacrificed their own happiness to give their daughters a chance at freedom. But they understood that their achievements honored not just their own gifts, but the courage and love of those who had made their journey possible. Their story reminds us that genius is not a privilege of the few, but a possibility for all, and that the greatest discoveries often come not from those we expect, but from those we least expect to surprise us. In a world that too often seeks to limit human potential based on superficial characteristics, the legacy of Dalila and Denise Water stands as an eternal reminder that the human mind knows no boundaries, and that true greatness lies not in individual achievement, but in lifting others to heights they never thought possible. As the 19th century drew to a close, their influence had spread far beyond the walls of St. Margaret's Orphanage. The principles they had discovered as children, that intelligence is diverse, that potential is universal, and that proper nurturing can unlock extraordinary capabilities in any individual, had become the foundation for a new understanding of human nature itself. Their story became a beacon of hope that would inspire generations of educators, scientists, and social reformers, proving that sometimes the most profound truths are revealed, not by those with the most power or privilege, but by those with the courage to see the world as it could be, rather than as it is. What an incredible journey through history. The story of Dalila and Denise Water shows us that human potential knows no boundaries, and that true genius lies not just in extraordinary ability, but in using that ability to lift others up. Their legacy reminds us that every child, regardless of background or circumstances, possesses unique gifts waiting to be discovered and nurtured. In a world that too often seeks to limit human potential based on superficial characteristics, their story stands as an eternal testament to the power of believing in the extraordinary capabilities that exist within every human being. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. History is full of remarkable individuals whose stories deserve to be told, and your support helps us bring these incredible narratives to light. What other historical stories would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below.